Welcome back to MarsCast, the podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary. I'm Jared Luchabor, and this is episode 2 of our 4-part series on the story of the United Reformed Churches in North America. Last time, we explored in depth the theological crisis in the Christian Reformed Church, the debates over women in office, biblical authority, hermeneutics, and confessional subscription that created such deep concern among many consistories. Today, we're looking at what happened next. How did concerned churches move from expressing grievances to actually forming a new federation? Back with me to discuss these things is Dr. Cornelis Venema from Mid-America Reformed Seminary. Let's walk through the Consistorial Conferences then of 1986 to 1990. And how they laid the groundwork for the formation of a new federation. Those were conferences that spanned several years and involved entire consistories, not just pastors. And they eventually led to what's called the Alliance of Reformed Churches. So maybe walk us through how the conferences worked, what kept the momentum going, and how the alliance prepared the way for the URC.
That's a very good question. This is where the story of the URC in North America really begins in earnest. I'll summarize it this way. In the midst of all these debates, disagreements, controversies revolving around the doctrine of Scripture's authority, its interpretation, the historicity of the biblical accounts, and related issues, there were increasingly voices being raised in the denomination on the part of individual members, sometimes on the part of groups within the denomination. I mean, you already had 2 magazines that were sort of representing the voices of the two sides, the more progressive side and the more conservative side. The outlook would be on the more conservative side. But you also had something called the concerned members of the CRC, which was a quasi-official organization of lay members from churches in Canada and in the United States that were holding conferences, and speeches were being made regarding these developments in the CRC. But the most significant thing was, in 1986, the consistory of the Linwood Christian Reformed Church in Linwood, Illinois, Classis Ileana, actually sent a formal letter to all the consistories of all the CRCs in North America, explaining why they were troubled by what was taking place in the denomination, that they were of the conviction that we were losing our moorings and our identity as a confessionally faithful denomination in North America, and offering objections to a number of developments. The requirement that you have to support denominational agencies by way of quotas, that had come up at a variety of assemblies of the church, and little freedom was granted to those who, by reason of conscience, were unwilling to support something they felt was unbiblical. They disagreed with the direction the denomination was going on the question of women's ordination. They were deeply troubled by compromising the historicity of the biblical record of the history of redemption, beginning with creation. They had a whole sort of laundry list of the sorts of things that were troubling the conservative. I always prefer to use the language confessional side, because ultimately it's not a question of simply conserving something by way of it being our tradition or a kind of traditionalism. It was a keen interest in our being confessionally reformed, uniquely identified, and our life and work as a denomination conforms to Scripture and confession. So they asked the question very directly of all the consistories, what can we do? What should we do? One of the consistories that responded to their letter was the Hospers Christian Reformed Consistory, at the time pastored by Dr. J. Mark Beach. They said, we suggest that you call a meeting of consistories of like mind and concern to take counsel together as to where do we go? What do we do? How do we, by what legitimate means can we, in a church orderly way, get the denomination back on track? That's sort of my language. So that took place in the South Chicago area near the Linwood Church, at the Linwood Church. They later met at a conference center a little further down the road called Village Woods. But they met annually, these consistorial conferences, for a number of years. And what happened in that period was the issues that the CRC was facing were being faced in many different denominations, broadly among evangelical churches, but also among Reformed and Presbyterian churches. And this formation of the Consistorial Conference attracted the interest of other, both Presbyterian and Reformed, from the continental side of things, churches that were coming to the meetings as observers, expressing solidarity with and a similar concern, in some cases similar things happening in their own denomination, so that at a certain point the question had to be faced, is this strictly a Christian Reformed movement? And it's a very complicated history, but I'll summarize it this way. At a certain point, they changed the name. First, it was called the Consistorial Conference. Then it became the Alliance of Christian Reformed Churches. A year later, it became the Alliance of Reformed Churches. And the reason for the name change is delegates were coming to these conferences from formerly CRC churches, but now no longer affiliated, having separated from the CRC, but they still wanted to cultivate fellowship, engage with each other, assist each other. So you have the anomaly of an alliance of federated, as the terminology was used, and non-federated churches, together with representatives of the OPC, some PCA, some Orthodox Christian Reformed churches, a little denomination that had been formed in this period, officially in 1988, of churches that had left the CRC. There were Protestant Reform people representing some portions of the Protestant Reformed Church. Canadian Reformed Church folk came. So there came to be within what was now called the Alliance of Reformed Churches a growing tension as to the purpose of the alliance. Is this just a perpetual, we'll meet every year and bemoan what's happening? Increasingly, a segment of that alliance said, well, we need to realign. We need to be joined together. We're Reformed. We're not Congregationalists. The situation in the CRC is not improving. It's going, in some respects, from bad to worse. Where do we go from here? And so the alliance meetings in that period actually came to a point where they changed their constitution to say that they have at least two broad purposes. One is to facilitate fellowship among like-minded confessionally Reformed and Presbyterian churches in North America, to consult together, work together where possible. Their other purpose was to assist the churches that were leaving the CRC or contemplating leaving, to assist them in forming a new federation. So it comes to a head in 1995 when you get the first meeting subsequent to the Alliance of Reformed Churches meeting, where the delegates present representing churches, ministers and elders, discuss how do we go about forming a new denomination. And I don't know if this is the point where you want me to deal with that.
I'd like you to wrap this up with that first synod in Linwood, Illinois in 1996, the significance of that, because this is a climactic moment. This is where we could say the actual birth of the URC, of the federation took place.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'll summarize it this way. In 1995, that meeting took place, and they used language of provisional federation. So they didn't really technically, officially federate in 1995. They resolved to federate. The federation occurred, the official birth of the URCNA took place at a subsequent synod that they had resolved to hold the first synod of the URCNA in Linwood in 1996. I do want to just summarize in a very careful way. Until now, I'm giving you just the broad strokes, but here is what was done in 1995. They passed a series of resolutions, the first of which said that the underside or otherwise designated congregations determine, on the basis of a majority vote of each consistory council, to form a provisional federation of churches. So they resolved initially to put the matter at the local church level in its consistory with the congregation's approbation. Are you desiring to join this new federation, this that we're forming, that we haven't yet formed? The second resolution was that this federation would be based on God's holy word as confessed in the three forms of unity, and it would use initially, until a new church order was written for the new federation, it would make use of the church order of 1934 of the CRC-NA. During this period, the Alliance had formed its own committee as a means of assisting this act of federation that was already working on a church order but hadn't finished its work. So they used provisionally the 1934 CRC church order, which stems from the church order of Dort, until a new church order be adopted. Third resolution, that the independent Reformed congregations not represented at the meeting be invited to join and become part of the permanent new federation. Fourth resolution, 3 consistories would convene the meeting that would take place the next year. They were Lethbridge, Alberta, Wyoming, Michigan, and Wellandport, Ontario, to effect a permanent ecclesiastical organization and structure. They didn't adopt a permanent name. They adopted the provisional name, Fellowship of Uniting Reformed Churches in North America. Now, it was at the next year's gathering with delegations from, I don't recall the exact number of churches, I think roughly around 40 churches. They considered the name of the denomination. And I still remember I was there for this debate. Some in the Canadian churches were not happy with the ultimate choice, which was United Reformed Churches, plural, in North America, because the worry was the word united in Canada suggests the United Church in Canada, which is very progressive. But that was the name adopted. They considered a proposed church order that came from the special committee. They adopted it, but recognized that it needed perfecting, and so asked the consistories to come to subsequent synods with any proposals for improvement of that proposed church order. They allowed for a period of charter membership. Any church not yet a member wishing to join within the coming year could do so without their office bearers, particularly ministers, undergoing any kind of classical examination, sort of a grandfather them in. And they extended fraternal greetings to the Canadian Reformed churches, the Reformed Church in the U.S., and sent a letter of encouragement welcoming as members other churches still federated, still in the CRC, as well as independent churches. Because there were a group of churches at this point that called themselves a fellowship in the Western Michigan area, not all of whom were quite as keen to take the leap of joining a new denomination just yet. For example, Dutton was a little slow in joining the URC for fear. There was a lot of concern that whatever form of government the new denomination adopts by way of its church order, it wouldn't compromise the appropriate relative autonomy of the local church. There was a great fear of a kind of a hierarchical structure, which many viewed the CRC as having developed over the course of time in this particular period. So that's the story of how at those 2 decisive meetings, first a resolution to federate, And then in 1996, a decision to proceed to effect that federation. That's when the United Reformed Churches were born. Only 3 classes, roughly 40 churches, but it was a beginning.
Maybe as you reflect back nearly 3 decades later, what did the Founding Fathers get right, and maybe pass on some wisdom to younger generations who are a part of this federation?
Well, I would judge that they got the things that are most fundamental and principal right. That is, this is not to say that there weren't aspects of this history where things were not done perhaps in the best possible way. There's a lot of messiness, and there's a lot of sorrow and sadness and splits and separations that didn't always go, as they seldom do, smoothly. It was a difficult time. I think there was a great deal of sorrow and sadness both within the CRC as it remained, and among those in the CRC who remained, who were sympathetic to the positions of those who left. And, there was a cost that people paid. I mean, there were all kinds of ministers who, at the classical level, were simply deposed, even after they had left the Federation. They were declared deposed. But the fundamental thing was, and I always tell my students, there were differences of opinion among those who seceded and formed the new denomination. Some had a more radical view of the seriousness of the problem in the CRC and were prepared to sort of declare the CRC in its totality a false church, or the churches false churches. The predominant opinion, however, was not of that sort. It was that the CRC was no longer a confessionally reformed church that was serious about its confessions, unembarrassed about the distinctive features of its government of his life as a denomination, the way it worshiped, liturgical practice, and all of the things that were regarded as biblical, not simply reform, because reformed is simply a synonym for biblical. It's a desire to govern the church, to carry out the church's work and task in a way that is conformed to the ultimate standard given to us in Scripture and the subordinate standard of the 3 forms of unity. So they got a lot of things right. They got the fundamental things right. The desire was to preserve, and not only to preserve, but to propagate with not in a sense of embarrassment, but with a sense of enthusiasm, the riches of our Reformed inheritance as churches. Now, one of the more controversial issues, I suspect, looking back, was the creation of a church order that you might say modified the church order of the CRC as it stemmed from the church order adopted at the Synod of Dort already for the Dutch churches in the 17th century at the Synod of Dort. They removed a number of the features of that church order, largely out of a concern to resist overreaching on the part of broader assemblies, whether classis or synod, in terms of the government of the local church. And I think the denomination in its subsequent history has spent an awful lot of time, I use the language, it's a little tongue-in-cheekish, tinkering with the church order, that we've slowly, over the course of now almost 30 years, come to a bit of a recognition that some of the features of the older church order that were removed, perhaps in some form, should have been retained. And so we're gradually restoring some features that belong to the older church order that were lost in the earliest. At the most recent Synod of the United Reformed Churches met in Escondido in 2024, they spent days, quote unquote, perfecting the church order, because some of the language in the church order was inconsistent. It had a little bit of the character of something that had been put together in the context of controversy, and they hadn't really dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's and gotten it exactly right. So the church order at this point is in a better place, I would judge, and is more well received throughout the URCs than if you study the history of the URC through its synod, you'll discover that there's been a lot of engagement with church order issues at almost all of the synods.
Maybe just offer some wisdom to younger generations who are part of this federation. What would you say to them? What sort of encouragement would you give to them as the federation continues its existence?
One of the concerns I have about the United Reformed Churches in North America in terms of its relatively brief history, only 30-some years, that's about a generation. So we have a whole new generation of members in churches that belong to the United Reformed Churches in North America. And it's characteristic even of our culture, and we are inevitably influenced by the culture. We don't have much of a historical awareness, particularly in the younger generation. I don't know if that's a fault of the older generation and not telling the story very well. But we have a long history. It's not 30 years. I like to sort of paraphrase what the author of Hebrews says about Melchizedek, without father or mother or beginning of days. Some people have the notion that the church just sort of pops on the scene. We know not whence it came. We need to know more about the history even of the CRC and its roots, and the history of the Reformed churches, of which our federation is a part and an expression. If we're really going to be self-conscious about our identity, what we are about. And I think part of the worry about too much uniformity and overreaching on the part of broader assemblies has produced something of what I call an ethos in the URC, where we're very independent and locally church-minded, and that we're part of a larger body of churches federated together, and that we have opportunities to cultivate together better relations, to work in a cooperative way with each other. We got a long ways to go in that respect. I mean, we're very far removed from the CRC as I remember it from my youth. My father was a Christian Reformed minister. I grew up in a Christian Reformed home with a long history with our roots in the Reformation in the Netherlands. And there was a good, healthy love for and interest in what we were doing as a denomination, not just our local congregation, but who we were as a federation or denomination of churches. And the institutions and the work of the CRC in foreign missions, home missions, education was rather extraordinary for the size, relatively speaking, of the denomination. I think it was Billy Graham said that it was a sleeping giant because of all of its institutional development, Calvin College, Calvin Seminary, colleges elsewhere, Christian schools, tremendous amount of programs in terms of classical home mission, church planting, world missions. At one time, the cohort of CRC worldwide missionaries was pretty impressive for a small denomination. And the Lord blessed that work. What I'm getting at is, and I'll talk about that more in subsequent episodes when we talk about the more recent history of the URC, I think one of the encouraging things that's occurring in the URC is that we're recognized. We're not here simply to perpetuate, preserve an inheritance. We have been richly blessed and have immense opportunities to, in our local churches, within their communities, in the classical context in terms of church planting, and beyond that, both domestically and in terms of international missions, world missions. I think that'll be part of the answer to the question of the coming generation's enthusiasm and vitality in terms of our federation. We have to simultaneously know our history and have respect for the past and what we've received from it, but we also have to have our face focused forward. And where do we go from here? And why do we exist as a federation of churches? And it's not simply to preserve something we've received, it's to communicate it. It's the gospel. It's the Reformed biblical understanding of the gospel that we have to live by, and that has to be underneath everything we do.
When we consider the birth of the URCNA, what becomes clear is that this wasn't a hasty or an impulsive decision, but a carefully considered response to serious theological concerns rooted in love for the Reformed faith and a desire for biblical faithfulness. Next time on MarsCast, we'll consider the confessional backbone of the URCNA and explore its adherence to the three forms of unity, the church order, and what it means to be a confessionally reformed federation. If you found this episode helpful, share it with your consistory, your congregation, or anyone interested in Reformed church history. This has been MarsCast, the official podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary. I'm Jared Luchbor. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you next time.